Good afternoon, everyone. It's so nice to see you all here today for Holocaust Remembrance Day. My name is Allison Maurer. I'm a librarian at Marriott Library, and I want to welcome you to today's event. We are honored to be joined by two esteemed professors at the U of U to serve as our panelists, Dr. Amos Giora and Dr. Bob Goldberg, whom I will introduce in full shortly. We would also like to welcome our venerated moderator, Dr. Hollis Robbins, Dean of the College of Humanities and noted scholar of 19th century African-American literature, film, music, and poetry. Her latest book, which I was going to bring, but it's checked out, is Forms of Contention on the African-American Sonnet. It was published in 2020. So welcome, everyone. Our session today will reflect on Germany's war against the Jews from an American perspective. Content and discussion during today's event will be sensitive. We want to acknowledge the importance of taking care of yourself when talking about topics such as discrimination, hate, and violence. Two therapists from the University Counseling Center are here with us today. Should anyone need support, their crisis walk-in service is also available daily through 5 p.m. And we have books available for checkout that illuminate these topics, including excellent, wonderful books written by our panelists. You definitely have to come check those out. We want events like these to be generative, where you can feel inspired to create something new, study something new, think in a new way, or do something differently. The University of Utah embraces freedom of speech and academic freedom for this very reason. We encourage lively debate and discussion of all topics of public importance. This embrace of the sharing of ideas is central to civic life in a democratic society, and especially a healthy and vibrant university campus such as ours. As members of the university community, we strive for high quality participation, meaningful civil dialogue, patience, and a willingness to learn, especially in the face of words with which we might disagree. Respect for all participants is essential for the well-being of all members of the university community. The speech policy of the U calls for no heckling, no obscene speech, no defamatory remarks, and no disruptions that would limit the free expression of our moderator and panelists. And signs are not permitted in this venue. Utah also prohibits threatening speech that incites violence. Now, introductions. Dr. Giora is professor of law at the S.J. Quinney College of Law at the University of Utah. He's a distinguished fellow at the Consortium for the Research and Study of Holocaust and the Law at Chicago-Kent College of Law, and a distinguished fellow and counselor at the International Center for Conflict Resolution, CAT School of Business at the University of Pittsburgh. For the past 10 years, Giora has been researching, writing, lecturing on the question of bystanders, originally in the Holocaust, resulting in this book, his book, The Crime of Complicity, The Bystander in the Holocaust, which I highly recommend. He also has written Armies of Enablers, Survivor Stories of Complicity and Betrayal in Sexual Assaults. And he spearheaded the Bystander Initiative, designed to address the problems when nothing is done to stop abuse. Professor Giora has an AB in history from Kenyon College, a JD from Case Western Reserve University School of Law, and a PhD from Leiden University. Welcome, Dr. Giora. Dr. Goldberg received his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and came to Utah in 1980. He was a professor of history at the University of Utah until his retirement in 2021. Bob is the author of 8 books. I couldn't believe it was like a half a shelf. With his last 2, Barry Goldwater and Enemies Within, The Culture of Conspiracy in Modern America, also which I highly recommend. It's over on the table along with Back to the Soil. It's about Utah Jewish history, and it's such a wonderful book, so highly recommend both of those. Bob has won 12 teaching honors, including the University of Utah Distinguished Teaching Award. In 2003, he held the Fulbright Distinguished Chair in American Studies at the Swedish Institute for North American Studies at Uppsala University. In 2008, he received the Rosenblatt Prize for Excellence, the University of Utah's highest award. Welcome, Dr. Goldberg.
Thank you.
Dr. Robbins, welcome, and please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. And there's a few chairs up in the front so for anybody who would like to sit up front. So on Holocaust Remembrance Day, on Holocaust Memorial Day, we remember Germany's war against the Jews. Here, a modern industrialized state transcended its national borders to commit the mass murder of innocent people. In the end, 2/3 of Europe's Jews and 1/3 of the world's Jewish population were slaughtered. Although thousands of miles away, Americans proved less than innocent bystanders to these events. This discussion today will explore the beliefs and values of the perpetrators of genocide, to realize the roles of leaders and opinion makers in shaping the perceptions of those who followed. We ask only not why it happened, but how it happened. In remembering the past, we ask about our responsibilities as leaders, as citizens in the present. What does the increasing normalization of anti-Semitism in the United States portend for American Jews and the core values and institutions of our country? So we're going to begin by watching a short 6-minute film from the PBS Ken Burns documentary, The U.S. and the Holocaust. And after, we'll open the discussion with Dr. Giora and Dr. Goldberg. Thank you. That's a excellent place to start. The idea of us looking back. And with that, I'm going to toss things off to our resident historian. Bob, give us a little bit of the context of 1936 and the anti-Semitism and the inaction.
Thank you, Hollis. I'm going to actually pick up events in 1933. In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt was sworn in as President of the United States. And in 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. There should have been no surprise for anyone as to what Adolf Hitler's goals were in 1933, because he had written a book. He had written a book called Mein Kampf, which means my struggle or my battle. And in that book, he outlined what his plans were, what his policy were for not only the Jews, but for Europe as well. In Mein Kampf, Hitler divides the world into two: good and evil, world of God and the devil. On one side are the Aryan people, the Germanic people, a force for good. And Hitler claimed that the Germanic people, the Aryan people, had a mission, and that mission was to purify the world of evil. And that evil was the Jews. The Jews, who Hitler said were the spawn of Satan, an inferior race, an inferior breed, who carried a stain, a rot, a perversion in the blood, in the genes. And it was a perversion and a rot and a stain that could not be washed away by baptism. Jews had a genetic problem, a heredity problem. By birth, they were greedy, cunning, disloyal, immoral, and conspiracy-minded. And their greed, he said, knew no bounds, no control. They sought world power and world domination. The Jews, he said, were puppet masters. The Jews were the hidden hands behind events, behind revolution, war, recession, depression, all the major events. And as we talk later today, we're going to talk about the Jewish hands allegedly behind election fraud and pandemics in our world today. The puppet masters. The beast, he said, had many tentacles. On the one hand, the Jews were extreme capitalists. They were world bankers. They controlled trade and money supply. And on the other hand, they were Marxists and revolutionaries seeking to control the working classes. He claimed that Jews had no loyalty to country. They were not patriotic. They were parasites and bloodsuckers on the body politic. To save civilization from the Jews, Hitler demanded that Germany rearm. Germany reclaim the lands lost in World War I, and Germany expand, needing living space, Lebensraum, and that was land to the east, in Poland, Hungary, and the Soviet Union, where Germany would use the people, the factories, the farms of those countries to build his 1,000-year Reich. And everyone knew who read that book, everyone knew that those goals could only be affected by war. In Germany, the Jewish space became constricted immediately. And let me note, Jews constituted less than 1% of the German population in the 1930s. Jewish professors lost their job at universities. Jewish doctors were prohibited from practicing in hospitals. Jewish stores were boycotted. Jewish students were expelled from school. Jews were forbidden to own automobiles. Jews were forbidden to own radios. 1938, Kristallnacht, a government-organized, government-planned, government-directed orgy of violence against Jews. The synagogues of Germany were burned to the ground. Jewish stores and businesses were looted and destroyed. And after, Jews of Germany were herded off to concentration camps. And their property raffled off to the Christian neighbors. And their homes and apartments, gone, auctioned off as well. In 1939, war came to Poland and the lands to the east. And Nazi killing squads descended on towns and villages. Killing squads, killing Jews on contact and in place. And in the cities, Jews were stripped of their citizenship. Jews were ordered to wear yellow stars on their chests and on their backs. And Jews were herded into ghettos. In Warsaw, in a space that 35,000 people had lived before the war, 500,000, 500,000 people were crowded and then systematically starved. And then off to the death camps, where they were gassed and burned. And everything recycled. Hats, shirts, pants, coats, canes, toys, taken from the murdered. Along with the Jews, the Roma, gay men, religious and political dissidents, persecuted and murdered. And to what the Nazis called the useless eaters. The useless eaters, those who were mentally and physically handicapped and challenged, they too were killed. In all, 6 million Jews were killed. 2/3 of the Jews of Europe, 1/3 of the Jews of the world. In Poland, 90% of 3 million Jews were killed. In Hungary, 70% of 800,000 people were killed. In Belarus and Ukraine, more than 1 million Jews were killed. And this was death regardless of age, regardless of gender. They were all innocent. You know, the statistics of mass murder are beyond comprehension. The statistics numb us. They blind us. They distance us from the reality. Terms like annihilation, extermination, and slaughter blunt the impact of murder times 6 million. Each lost was a mother, a father, a sister, a brother. Each was a human with dreams and hopes and loves and fears. Entire families vanished. Entire communities vanished. And included in those lost were relatives of mine and Professor Giora. It was, in my mind, the greatest humanitarian crisis of the 20th century.
Thank you.
So Professor Goldberg is the historian. My contribution here is, if you will, more personal. My parents, who are both deceased, were Holocaust survivors, and I am their only child. And I was raised in a family where the decision was made by my parents when they got married 100 years ago to never discuss the Holocaust. So I grew up not knowing anything about my parents or anything about the Holocaust. And then you referenced the book, The Crime of Complicity. So I ended up writing a book about my parents and the Holocaust, which is how I got into the bystanders discussion. And there I learned that my grandparents were murdered on May 26, 1944 in Auschwitz. My mother is in many ways the Anne Frank of Budapest, with the obvious exception that she survived, unlike Anne Frank. And my father survived 2 death marches. And so when I was invited, and thank you for inviting me, what's of particular importance to me, not only as an educator like Professor Goldberg, but as one whose family is what we call hardcore Holocaust, is to bring it as much as possible on 2 different levels to this distinguished audience. 1 or 3, if you will. 1, there is in the United States at the moment, I leave it, maybe Goldberg knows, a terrible undertaking of what is called Holocaust denial. We need to be very honest about this. And Holocaust denial is, I don't know if it's a fad or if it's a thing, but it's there. And one of the important, from my perspective, contributions in a conference like today, in a session like today, is to make it very clear the Holocaust happened. And Holocaust denial is out there. That's one. Two, if you obsessively track anti-Semitism like me, you will see that there is a serious spike in anti-Semitism. Some of it is polite, which is, pardon my English, which is BS, because anti-Semitism is anti-Semitism and needs to be addressed directly, concretely, and concisely. And three, Goldberg will help me with the polite term. I don't want to use the term Holocaust ignorance, but there's clearly a need to educate about the Holocaust. So if you take Holocaust denial, anti-Semitism, and lack of information about the Holocaust, it leads to the following. When my book came out, I was inundated with death threats. The death threats were clear, precise, concise, where to kill me, how to kill me. And I remember sharing with my mom, who died less than a year ago, Yortzeit, right? Less than a year ago, that her only child who had written a book about the Holocaust was the recipient of vile death threats. And my mother could not wrap her mind around the fact how in 2017, 18, that the son of Holocaust survivors is receiving outrageous death threats because I had the temerity to write a book about the Holocaust. And that for me was a very powerful moment of recognition that it's out there, as ugly as it is. And for me, absolutely reinforced the need at every opportunity, wherever invited, whenever invited, to speak not only about my parents, but also to speak about my grandparents. Because one of the great fears of people like me, I'm second generation. Third generation still is aware of the Holocaust because they have interaction with Holocaust survivors. One of the great concerns now is what will happen in fourth generation. And for instance, in my family, so my grandchildren had a wonderful relationship with my parents, who are Holocaust were Holocaust survivors, but my grandchildren will not know a survivor. And that raises really significant questions about how to educate what is called the fourth generation. And trust me, we are well aware of the fact, for instance, in Germany, there is what is called Holocaust fatigue, because you college students who would be third generation, your peer group in Germany, as we say in Hebrew, is saying, Daenu, enough, leave us alone. We are not responsible for the Holocaust. And one of the great challenges today in education, whether here or in Europe, is how indeed to educate when people don't have interaction with Holocaust survivors, confronted by this awful, awful Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism. And that's something that we're going to absolutely have to address head on directly, because otherwise, what do you historians have to say? History repeats itself. And that is a source of profound concern.
Well, we say history echoes less than repeats itself. But Holocaust denial is not a new thing. In fact, you can see Holocaust denial during the Holocaust, because there was a concentration camp called Theresienstadt, which was a model concentration camp where they allowed the Red Cross people to come and say, we're not doing anything. All these are claims that are inaccurate. Theresienstadt was just a model, was a facade. The Germans started digging up the people that they had killed, Babi Yar, for example, which is near Kyiv. Okay, they dug them up and then burned the bodies because they didn't want any evidence. The death marches that your dad was on was taking those people in the concentration camps, in the work camps, away from advancing Soviet armies and taking them closer to Germany so they could extinguish that claim or the traces of the Holocaust. They were blowing up crematorium as well in the concentration camps. Dwight Eisenhower, general of the armies, was touring concentration camps, and he insisted that army photographers take pictures of everything they saw, because he said, I do not doubt that in a generation or two, people will start doubting the Holocaust, and we need to have proof. We need to have proof that people can understand and see.
I think that. Oh,
No,
sorry.
you
No,
go ahead.
I
I'll
just-
jump in.
When I wrote my book, I said to my mom, my father, that when I started writing the book was cognitively disabled. I told my mom I want to write a book because I finally want to understand who the hell I am and where I come from. And my mother, who was you met my mom, right? She was 5'2", 97 pounds, but nobody took any shit from my mom. She asked me not to write the book. And I said, well, let's think about it. And she finally said, okay, write the book. But she said, I won't read it. Because she understood exactly what I was going to do, which was to uncover, see if I can make my way through this, to uncover the absolute horrors of her Holocaust, and then to uncover the absolute horrors of his Holocaust, and then to interview people. And I met with all kinds of people. And I was finally able to absolutely piece together how she survived in the attic in Budapest, and how my father indeed survived 2 god-awful death marches. But what was important for me is I write about the bystander. I leave the perpetrators, Hitler and friends, to others. But I am of the firm belief that without the bystander and the enabler, the Holocaust never happens. So we can talk about Hitler and friends until tomorrow, but if we don't have an honest conversation about those who saw and who knew, nothing will really be understood about the Holocaust. And that was made clear to me. I spent a day with a Hungarian genealogist in my father's godforsaken hometown in Eastern Hungary. And I don't know how many of you have been to Hungary, but if you bribe enough people, you can get all the information you want. And so I made my way to the train station, and I stood on the train platform where my grandparents had been deported on May 26, 44. And you can't make this up. I'm standing on the platform, and a train that looked literally from the 1940s, pulls into the train station, and it is there on the train platform. If you really want to understand the Holocaust and the bystander and the perpetrator, it's on the platform. Because I was able to visualize, whatever the hell that word means, the bad guys shoving my grandparents onto a train, but more importantly, my grandparents' neighbors standing on the damn platform, watching my grandparents being shoved into a train. And that, for me, in the context of writing the book, was one of the most powerful moments. And the second one was when I went to the courtyard where my mother was going to be shot. And you understand that people were there, she was saved, but that's the bystander and the enabler that, for me, is the essence of this conversation.
2 points I want to make as this conversation continues. One, the ideas that I expressed in terms of Mein Kampf and Adolf Hitler, the idea of the Jews as the puppet masters, the Jews as the hidden hands. We hear and see that today. We hear and see that today. And I'm just going to give you an example, and I think we'll expand on this more. But some of you have heard the name George Soros, who was a Hungarian child sent to a concentration camp, who became a financier, became a philanthropist. George Soros has been blamed in the last 3 to 4 years for financing the Latin American caravans coming across the border, for paying for the protests in the wake of George Floyd's death, of financing the NFL players who took the knee. George Soros has also been accused of owning the lab in Wuhan where the virus allegedly escaped. And I can go on and go on with that. The other point I want to make is in regard to the bystander. You're hearing Amos speak about the people who are on the ground at the time, standing, not so innocently, standing as bystanders. But I also want to emphasize that the leaders of the United States of America were bystanders. The American leaders could have done much, much more than they did without political risk. Without political risk. And they chose instead to do nothing. They were bystanders, but not innocent bystanders.
I would just add to Professor Goldberg's word on the bystander. The question when we talk about the bystanders, are they also criminally complicit? Are they criminally liable? And in the 6 minutes here of this outstanding documentary by Ken Burns, it raises really profound questions, perhaps uncomfortable, whether not only were they bystanders, which sounds passive, but I would suggest that the 20,000 people screaming at that rally, go team go, and the American politicians who enabled it, created the ecosystem that enabled that, I think on some level they are complicit. And the word complicit for us lawyers carries a certain weight. It's not passive, it's active. And then the following question is whether or not retroactively. There's a sense of accountability that needs to be imposed on them. And when Morris wrote the great book, well, 6 million died, he was the first one to address this. I'm not sure he used the word accountability and complicity, but it is a serious question we need to ask ourselves in terms of American history. Where was America? And right, the New York Times put it on, was it section D, page 46, about this big, right? It was as if you don't write about it, it doesn't exist. And then there was no social media. If the New York Times didn't write about it, it didn't exist. And that really raises questions, not only about these distinguished groups, like was it the Foreign Legion, the American Foreign Legion and the others, Daughters of the American Revolution. I think we need to ask ourselves in terms of Americana and xenophobia, if that is more than just being merely a bystander and or enabler. If indeed retroactively, we need to ask ourselves whether American politicians need to be held accountable, at least, if you will, metaphorically.
I want to jump in to ask a little bit about silence. So you talked about your parents' silence, Amos, which is a different kind of silence than the silence of others, the silencers who refuse to see, the silence of the press, the silence of the government, and the very loud voices of those who did not want refugees, do not want Jews to come here. So can you talk a little bit about what was in the newspapers at the time? And I was going to say my own family, my grandmother's family was killed in Jelgava massacres in 1941. They never talked about it at home. They didn't talk about it even after the war and said, we never knew. We never knew. But I went back and I looked at the Times, and there was actually some coverage. So there was a silence of not seeing as well.
Yeah, there were reports, scattered reports, but State Department knew as early as 1942 of massacres occurring. The Pope knew as early as 1942 that massacres are occurring. Did Franklin Roosevelt at the bully pulpit as president, in his fireside chats, in his speeches, say anything? And what the State Department and Franklin Roosevelt did was suppress that news. So the news was there, but it was incumbent upon the President of the United States to awaken a people. And that is something that Franklin Roosevelt did not do. And I just want to talk about that clip you just saw, about 10,000 Jewish kids, ages what, 4 to 14? Well, let me give you the context of why that was a problem. The United States in 1924 passed the law which ended open immigration, relatively open immigration to the United States. And what they said in 1924 is, we're going to give each country a quota, a number of people who can come from that country each year to the United States. And that number is going to be based on the 1890 census. 2% of a nationality, Swiss, Swedish, whatever, 2% of that number in the country in 1890 can get into the United States. The number for Germany was approximately 26,000 per year. The State Department delayed, obfuscated, and did everything it possibly could to keep the numbers of Jewish refugees from Germany down, such that in 1933, only 5% of that quota was filled. In 1934, 14%. In 1935, 20%. Only in 1 year was that quota completely filled, the year of 1939, when these kids were trying to come in. And that's why they had to go to Congress to try and get those kids over the quota. 1 year, which means there were 190,000 spaces that weren't used between 1933 and 1941. 190,000 people who could have been saved according to the law without political risk, but were left to die. That's what a bystander did.
So can we talk a little bit about, first of all, thank you both for the conversation this far, about when you spoke to bystanders, when you spoke to the people who did nothing, and when we think sort of bring our conversation a little more broadly out about responsibility, even responsibility now to teach a very traumatic episode. And I think if there's one thing that young people have brought to the table and allowed us to do is openly acknowledge trauma and acknowledge the trauma of telling a story, of not telling a story, of of looking at pictures of somebody else's story and the trauma of your own story. So the question of bystanders and tie it a little bit more together in what responsibilities or how we teach about responsibilities of bystanding today.
So when I wrote the book, I spent a lot of time in Europe. And I made my way to Maastricht, which is a town in southern Holland. And there I was told there's a woman who was 85 to 90 years old, who is a Gentile, and she lived across the street from a Jewish family that was deported. And I was told she had heard about me and she was willing to meet with me for half an hour. And I said, that's great. The only problem is I don't speak Dutch in the translation. She's 100 years old. And how does all this work? Fine. I made my way to her house and there was a young translator there and got into her house. And she said, you know, there's a Dutch tradition. You come to my house, you have to drink tea. And I thought, how long will it make her to make the tea? And I'm mindful of the half hour. I have the tea. We lost 10 minutes. And then she said, you know, there's a Dutch tradition. If you have tea, you have to have cookies. There's another 10 minutes. Fine. Okay. And then she tells me the following. On the day of the deportation, her father told her to go across the street to say goodbye to her classmates because her classmates were going to be deported. And she went across the street. She said goodbye. She comes back. And her father said, you know, close the curtains. And she did what any 12-year-old does when you're told what to do. You do the opposite. And she saw the mother carrying a baby, 2 children go onto the truck, and they were taken to Auschwitz. She's telling me the story. She says, you know, my father was the greatest man ever. He raised 6 children on his own. And those of you know about wartime conditions in Holland, they were awful for everybody. And then she says, you think my father was a bystander? And she starts crying. And I don't do well with 85-year-old women who cry. And I said, I didn't say it, you're saying it. It was a stupid thing to say, probably. And she said, you have to understand, there was nothing for him to do. But yes, he saw. Then we have this discussion about, was he a bystander? That's why, again, she tells me about that she had 6, there were 5 siblings and they were all alone. And then she's really breaking down. She says, young man, I love being called young man. She said, young man, you need to leave. I said, I think that's a good idea. And then she called me back and she brought me back into her kitchen. And I hadn't noticed it in the kitchen. There's nothing on the wall, 0, with one exception. Let's see if I can do this. There's one picture on the wall of the 3 kids who were murdered in Auschwitz. And she said, take a picture of it and keep it in your, she didn't know iPhone, but keep it with you, which I did, which I have with me wherever I go in the world. But it highlighted for me the extraordinary complexity. Here was a father, 6 kids, the mother was deceased. He's trying to make his way through the war, which was awful for Gentiles as well in the Netherlands, because let's have a separate talk about that. Was he a bystander? I don't know. On some level, yes. What could he have done? I don't know. Hang on. So I finally left her and it was horrible. She died 2 weeks later. And I have been asked if I hold myself on some level, I don't know if accountable is the word, accountable, responsible for her death, because I forced her to address something that obviously she hadn't thought about for 60 years. I'm truly sorry she died, obviously. But I think if we're going, this goes to Hollis's question, if we're going to have these discussions, they're brutal, they're awful, but there ain't no plan B.
Do you want to jump in on that, Bob?
There is no plan B. Okay. You know, my entire life has been dedicated to education. We know the past. We know what happened. We know what we did wrong. Maybe we could figure out a better future. That's my whole career is based on that. That's why I look to this generation as a hope, as the future. But folks, Americans don't live in the past. They barely live in the present. They're always in the future. And their minds are filled with amnesia, if you will. So I look at what Amos and I do is trying to wake folks up. It's not simply about Jews. It's about every other group that has been persecuted in our society, in the world. And unless we keep our eyes focused on that persecution to better life for everyone, we're not fulfilling our birthright as Americans.
I think the general point is, the larger point is, how do we talk about trauma? How do we talk about the trauma of historical trauma, of this particular historical trauma, without causing trauma, and have a productive conversation? And I think all of us as educators are doing that. And I think in some ways the Holocaust, because it is particular, and I'm thinking of Pablo Neruda's poem, Trying to Tell You Something, explaining a few things. When he's talking about the difficulty, it's a poem about the difficulty of sharing trauma. And he says, there's a line, the blood of children ran through the streets like the blood of children, because there's nothing else to compare it to. And we think so much historically by comparing things to other things, yet all traumas, all national, international traumas are unique. And how, as we're about to open up to conversation in a few minutes, how should we think about productive conversations about traumas that are uncomparable?
So one of the obvious realities of life is that this sounds cynical, but I don't mean it. Holocaust survivors are a dying breed. My mom died in last May. My father died 7 years ago. And according to statistics, because today is also obviously in Israel, also Holocaust Remembrance Day, there are 150,000 Holocaust survivors left in Israel, set two, that's it. People like my parents, who had much to tell, as Bob knows, never talked, ever. And it's a real question in terms of, this goes to your point. I tried, once I started writing the book, to get my mom to engage with young people, and the answer was absolutely not. My father was a brilliant academic, and I asked him to write, at least for his grandchildren, and I got a paragraph, a whole paragraph. I gave him an F, by the way. Because my father had extraordinary writing abilities, and he absolutely refused. There are other Holocaust survivors who I know who, in spite of their age in their 90s, are willing to go out there and talk. Without making this about me, as a second generation who now knows his parents' story inside, outside, I absolutely, this sounds pompous as hell, but I feel a sense of a torch that's been passed on to me, because I can talk about my parents until tomorrow, and I can talk about my father's godforsaken hometown, and I can talk about my mother's experiences in the goddamn attic in Budapest. And I think there's absolutely a responsibility for a second generation like me to do it, because if we don't do it, the third generation won't do it. And then I'm really genuinely concerned about the fourth generation, because that is a critical issue, because that goes to Bob's point, is if we don't talk about it, if we don't write about it, it will dissipate into the annals of history, and it'll just, what's the expression? The dustbin of history. And that's something that we can't afford, because we all know that if we forget about whatever atrocity or genocide that happened, it'll go away and it'll be minimized, and 6 million will be a number that doesn't mean a goddamn thing. And it's only a matter of time before it happens again. And hence, there is an expression in Judaism, right? The whole never again, right? The never again is significant, because if you are at least aware of it, it minimizes the possibility that it will happen again. And if you get, we're all with social media, Facebook, and there are a million distractions out there. But at the end of the day, 6 million Jews were murdered, full stop.
We all have to be witnesses. That's the bottom line. It is our responsibility as human beings to be witnesses to what has happened. We are so often confronted today with people who lie, people who don't tell us the truth, people who make things up. The whole Holocaust, the Holocaust deniers. In my life, I never thought that they would be so prominent. I thought, isn't this a given? Don't we all know? Don't we all understand? I was wrong. 66% of Gen Zs and millennials do not know what happened at Auschwitz. Don't know why Auschwitz is important. 60% of Gen Zs and millennials are not able to identify the number 6 million and its meaning. That is a travesty. That tells me that the education process is breaking down. And I'm not just saying the university is at fault or the schools are at fault. We're at fault, because the data and the material is out there. And if you don't like to read, the films are out there. But it is your responsibility, every one of yours responsibility, to be a witness to history. To be a witness to history and counter the falsehoods and counter the lies. It's on your backs, it's on my backs.
Can I
But we
just one
can't
quick-
be, we can't be bystanders to the truth.
I debated a professor, I won't tell you who or where, because he's too smart to be a Holocaust denier. He is what is nefariously called a Holocaust minimizer. So Holocaust minimizer, he says to me, Amos, it was only 2 million. Holocaust minimizers are out there. It's not funny. They are far smoother, smarter, more sophisticated than Holocaust deniers. And he actually has written this, and he really does use the phrase, it was only, actually, sorry, it was 2.5. At the end of this discussion with this absolutely vile, highly distinguished professor, he was put out his hand to shake my hand. Amos, this was really good, right? He's one of the 2 people in my life who have absolutely refused to shake his hand. Because I absolutely refuse to shake the hand of someone like that. The following day, I got a scathing letter from his rector provost that I had violated the good manners of academia. And by publicly not shaking his hand, I had embarrassed not only myself, but I had embarrassed my hosts, and it was incumbent upon me to acknowledge his argument. I find that to be so outrageously nefarious that is outrageous, but you need to know it's out there. Would you shake his hand? Shook his hand?
No.
No way. Like, no way.
So I would like to open it up to questions for those of you who have seen the film, the Ken Burns film, which I really recommend. It's a good film. It's an excellent film, particularly about the bystanders in the United States, what we could have done, what the law allowed, what the conversation might have been. So we could talk about the Ken Burns documentary. We could talk about the Holocaust itself. We could talk about the conversation that we've heard here. We could talk about trauma. Could we talk also, I would say, about how to educate about the Holocaust, particularly the trauma and the traumatic pictures. I recall as in elementary school, I think, seeing films of the freeing of the opening of Auschwitz, of the skeletal individuals there, and thinking, like, it shocked me into a reality. And again, given discourse these days and given a lot of eyeballs on what could or should be taught in particularly grade schools, how do we teach? How do we teach this traumatic history when we've got individuals and governing bodies that do not want trauma on both sides, that don't want trauma in our classrooms? So I'd love to hear questions.
This is Allison again. We have 2 roving mics. This is being streamed, so we want everyone in the room to be able to hear. So
So repeat the question.
yeah, if you would just raise your hand, and Jordan and I will come to you, and then you could state your question into the mic, please.
So here, and then there.
Hello. I'm a history major, and I thoroughly appreciate your coming here to give this presentation. I myself have experienced Holocaust deniers, and I'm not Jewish. I'm not of your faith, but I am of faith. And my question to you is, we see anti-Semitism rising in this country. We see anti-Christian values or Christian beliefs rising in this country. What I know our responsibility will be to prevent that, but do you have any suggestions, I guess, how we can prevent that now? Because it's absolutely disgusting to me in this country.
One of my books was on the Ku Klux Klan. And what I did is I studied Ku Kluxers in a variety of communities in the United States. And the Klan that I studied was primarily anti-Catholic and anti-Semitic and anti-Black, anti-African-American. And what I found was when the minorities got together to fight the Klan, to oppose the Klan, to push the Klan back, it was ineffective.
Ineffective or effective?
Ineffective.
Ineffective.
What works is when white Christians, stand with minorities and say, what you are doing is not permissible. It is wrong, and we will oppose it. But I think what is incredibly important here is a solidarity across racial grounds, across gender grounds, across every ground. And that worked in these various communities. And when it didn't happen, when the ministers of Protestant churches were silent, when the newspapers that were Protestant were silent, the Klan ran the table and was as powerful as you could get for years. So one of the things I think is really important is you don't have to be Jewish to be upset about prejudice. You don't have to be African-American to be upset about discrimination. We should all be upset about these things. And again, remember who we are. We're Americans. This is not allowed.
I think if to follow up on Bob's point, there's a term called gaslighting. And I don't want to get into politics because I'll offend some of you. But when particular presidential candidates or aspirants use particular phrases when they speak to Jewish communities, like your loyalty is to Israel, that is beyond outrageous because it calls into question the dual loyalty of American Jews, casts into doubt whether as American Jews were more aligned with Israel, more aligned with America, and absolutely cast doubt as to our loyalty to America. And it would behoove not only the Jewish community to be outraged when that happens, it would absolutely behoove all of Americans to be outraged regardless of your politics. And the subtle or not so subtle gaslighting, even by those who profess to love Jews, the moment you gaslight, bless you, the moment you gaslight, you are anti-Semitic and you are encouraging anti-Semitism. Other than that, it's fine.
You know, to underline what Amos just said, anti-Semitism comes from the right and it comes from the left.
Absolutely, 100%.
Okay? I can find Democrats, I can find Republicans who pronounce anti-Semitic things.
Go ahead.
That does not
Oh, sorry.
preclude resistance.
Earlier, you spoke for a minute about holding bystanders either accountable, or you talked about being possibly the analogy to criminally complicit. In the frame of the United States, where we do have now third, fourth generation who barely know about the Holocaust, what other than reparations, which seems like a very specific suggestion, do you have any other suggestions? And I'm not saying other than because that's not a valid suggestion. I'm saying because we've talked about that. What other practical, concrete ways are there for Americans specifically to be held accountable?
You know, Hollis recommended you see the Ken Burns documentary. I probably disagree with her in regard to this because I feel that interpretation that Ken Burns produced was an interpretation that absolved American policymakers, absolved them. Okay. What I think we need to do as Americans, and again, we're at a university setting, so I'm going to make the pitch again. We have got to educate ourselves as to what history is about. We've got to educate ourselves in regard to what works logically and what works in terms of evidence. That's what I think we need to do. Because if we just act like silent sheep, we become bystanders to our own fate as well as our history's fate.
I would just add to that. So my kids went to school. I mean, we live in Israel, so my kids went to school in Israel. I don't know enough about the American educational system today. And I don't know when, if at all, American grade schools, junior high schoolers are taught about the Holocaust. I mean, I plead ignorance because I don't know. But I don't think there's any doubt that that's a topic that absolutely must be addressed and needs to be addressed candidly. I think it was 10 years ago or so, there was the Anne Frank caravan that was that was here in town. It was extraordinary. Those kinds of things are super important. And the more such events there are, the better it is because it's all about education.
You know, I taught Hebrew school for 25 years, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th graders. And every week they would come to see me and they would tell me about some anti-Semitic comment made in 7th grade, 9th grade, or 11th grade. And I always gave them the same advice. Confront. Confront. And that is advice I gave because one time when I was a freshman in college and a professor made a comment to me and I didn't respond. And I regretted it to this day. Confront it. Allow your friends to confront it, but do not take prejudice in silence. Because
Kills.
that only cultivates the prejudice.
Thank you. I think it's you. I think you're up if you have the microphone, the gentleman in the hat.
Well, I was going to ask a question a little bit about the politicization across the spectrum, top, bottom, left and right in America of anti-Semitism. But since that question was kind of already answered, I'm going to go to a second one that I had.
I just want to, before you stop asking your question, think about where the voices are, where the smears are. Marjorie Taylor Greene can talk about Jewish space lasers financed by the Rothschild family burning the forests of California. Lou Dobbs on Fox News can talk about the Zionist occupation government in Washington. Newt Gingrich can talk about George Soros buying the election in 2020. Ron DeSantis can talk about the George Soros-backed prosecutor in New York. Okay. I am amazed about how many people, reputable people, people who are opinion makers, opinion shapers, and I'm not even including the former president of the United States. I can give you a dozen things he said. And I can talk about the Democratic Congresswoman from Minnesota who has said nasty things in my mind. Okay. Be aware. It's all over. It's everywhere. You know, there was an article recently written by a Jewish columnist who said every Jew knows where his or her passport is. And that tells you that we as Jews remember the tragic scar, the tragic wound that we suffered, where a third of us were killed off. A third of us. It's stunning when you think about it.
So,
Be aware.
Go ahead.
I do want to hear your question and then thank you.
Well, it does have to do with the bystander effect and complacency more broadly. The
Places for
Holocaust,
complicity.
the complicity of violence, but the Holocaust was a series of state-enforced violence towards a marginalized group. Two other examples relative to the American perspective are the epidemics of police brutality, particularly towards Black and brown people in this country, and also the epidemic of mass shootings across schools. Typically, the documented videos that we see, typically of Black men being killed by police, people will be taking videos and documenting what is happening. However, there is a fear to intrude out of losing your own life. Correct. And so with the example of the Holocaust, I feel like when you were talking about the woman that you had met in Denmark, correct?
Holland.
There was a fear, Holland. There was a fear of intruding because of the extreme violence that the Nazi regime displayed through such a short period of time. So when it comes to confronting violence, what do we do, especially with the epidemics of mass shootings, of police brutality and violence towards Black people in this country? Is there any kind of lesson we can learn about how to combat that violence?
Thank you for
And the
that.
fear of it.
That's an excellent question.
So I'll make it quick because time is running out. I've been working over the course of the past years with Representative Brian King, who's a member of the Utah legislature. on both bystander and enabler legislation. And one of the things that we indeed have been looking into is the filming of and then the posting of, right? And there have been instances where people have been filming and not helping a person in distress. There's a case in Florida. And you are right about the filming of when there's a shooting of whether an African-American or anybody else, or the mass shootings. Posting is an effective way to get the information out, but far more effective when you see something is to dial 911. Law enforcement needs to be called. And there's absolutely a conversation, because I've been through this with Representative King. There is concern in the minority community that if you dial 911, will they view you as the minority, as the perp, or as the victim? There's absolutely that conversation. And we need to be very honest about that. But to your question, that indeed it was introduced in the Utah legislature, similar to what you were getting at. It's as somebody who's involved in legislative efforts, it's at the end of the day, for me, it's all about legislation, taking all this and funneling it into bystander and enabler legislation. But you are absolutely right to post stuff like that. But more importantly than that, to alert law enforcement as to something that's happening. And your question needs to be, what do we do when the bad actor is law enforcement? And there's today an increasing discussion in law enforcement community about, particularly post George Floyd, that the law enforcement community needs to have, pardon the expression, but a come to Jesus moment about cops as bad actors and cops as bystanders to bad cops. And that is a conversation that is very difficult to have. I've begun having that. It's absolutely the next step.
Thank you. And because time is over, I want to hand it back over to you, Allison, to wrap us up.
Well, please join me in thanking our moderator, Dr. Robbins, and our panel, Dr. Gore. Thank you all for attending. Please enjoy some beverages and come and check out the books. You can talk with me as a librarian if you want to check them out. And we have a few minutes for mingling with the panelists if you have time. Thank you.
And thank you for hosting this.
I just wanted to ask again.